Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Hutted Histories. This month we're going to look at the evolution of the Lee Enfield Rifle. A rifle that saw service with the British Army for over 70 years, in fact longer if you take into account cadet service and specialist roles. Because of that, we're not going to go into much detail with all of them for the simple reason that you could spend at least an hour on each of these variants very easily. So it's really just a sort of a whistle-stop tour to give you a flavour of how the rifles evolved and why they evolved and show you that process. So if we wind the clock back to the 1870s, the British Army at the time was still armed with the Martini Henry, which was a single-shot rifle with that underlever action, which had obviously a fairly slow rate of fire. In the 1880s, the War Office started looking for a magazine rifle, a rifle that could have a number of rounds in a magazine to speed up that rate of fire. And after a number of trials, by the end of the 1880s, in 1889, they adopted what became known as the Lee-Metford rifle. And so the Lee-Metford, I mean, it looks very, very similar to the Boer War long Lee Enfields, which we'll look at in a moment, but it was in fact a very different rifle indeed. It was designed to fire black powder cartridges, and so the rifling in the barrel was very different to the rifling that came later. It had a different shaped magazine, but at least it would hold 10 rounds. So the soldiers loading the rounds individually would push 10 rounds into the top of the magazine. It had this cut-off plate, which many of the Lee Enfields, the early Lee Enfields had as well, which meant that once you'd loaded the magazine, you could push the cut-off plate across so that the rifle wouldn't automatically load them, and you could effectively then just fire it single shot if you wanted to, or pull the cut-off plate out of the way, which would enable it to fire a whole magazine should you need to. The rifle had this grip along the side here, and the most noticeable thing really, especially when you're looking at them in photographs, because these rifles do still crop up in the First World War, certainly for soldiers in training. You see a lot of new army men with these. You'll note that the sling, instead of being fastened at this band and at the end of the butt, is in fact fastened in front of the magazine and up by the sling swivel, up by the piling swivel, which is pretty much the only one of these rifles that has a sling in that position. And as I say, the big problem with these was that once cordite had been introduced, the cordite rounds literally fouled the barrel very, very quickly, which meant that the rifling was of no use. It became unserviceable, and therefore the bullets would just wander off all over the place. So there was a need to redesign it. So that was the Lee-Metford, so the first magazine rifle, if you like, introduced to the British Army. That was introduced in December 1889. In 1894, there was a cavalry carbine version, because there was a need for mounted troops to have obviously a shorter rifle to carry on horseback, and so a shorter, lighter version with a completely different nose cap. The rear sight was protected with this leather cover so that it didn't get damaged while the troops were moving along on horseback. The magazine was greatly reduced, so it would hold 6 rounds instead of the 10 of the normal rifle. And it had this flat head on the bolts to make it much easier to handle and stop it getting caught. This particular one belonged to the 9th Lancers, so presumably it saw service in the South African War. And the Lee-Metford and Lee Enfield both had versions of this which looked very, very similar. This particular one is a Lee-Metford carbine, but the Enfield from a distance pretty much looks exactly the same. So the long Lee Enfield, as we would think of it, the sort of standard rifle of the Boer War, externally looks very, very similar. It doesn't have those grooves. The sling swivel is where we would expect it to be, from this band down to the butt. The magazine, again, slightly different design from the Lee-Metford, but this time the crucial thing is inside. The fact is that they've reworked the rifling side of the barrel, so that this time the barrel, the spiralling, the rifling inside the barrel, which twists the bullet as it throws it forwards, is now going the other way. It's now got a left-handed turn, which stopped it getting fouled up with the cordite rounds. So it became a much more useful weapon. All of these early rifles, as I say, were loaded singly. You'd put one round in after another. And because of that, they were also issued with a second magazine so that you could carry a spare with you. And the one that was on the rifle was actually attached by a chain, so that as you unloaded it, it would you wouldn't drop it. If you're in the middle of combat and it fell out, you wouldn't lose it in a rush when you reloaded the other one. That became an irrelevance once the charger loading mechanism was introduced with the short magazine Lee Enfield. The lessons of the South African War, one of those lessons was that the majority of the successful actions had been carried out by mounted infantry, so there was a need to look for a shorter rifle. As I've explained in other talks, that was the reason for developing the short rifle magazine Lee Enfield, and in theory this rifle could be used by troops on horseback or on foot, and certainly it meant that that great long rifle, you wouldn't need that to try and put that in a bucket on a rifle, on the side of a horse on the rifle bucket. But it also meant that the mounted troops had a longer rifle with a greater range, which was much more useful than the shorter carbines that they'd had in South Africa. As with the earlier rifles, the early short magazine Lee Enfield rifles still had the volley sights, which were this fixing at the front and a sight on the back. And the theory with this was that you'd look through the sight, and depending on the distance, you would alter this against the gauge, line that up through there, and basically the whole platoon or whole company are dropping bullets in a sort of a rain on a predetermined location. It was pretty much a waste of ammunition, so it was done away with pretty soon. But these early rifles, this is a Mark I, had a very different rear sight, a much more heavily engineered rear sight. The horns of the foresight curved in together. So it was actually a very, very different rifle to the Mark III, which was the standard rifle of the First World War. This was introduced across the army in 1904. This particular one was made in 1905, and it was pretty much a game changer because by this time they were loaded with chargers, which were basically clips of 303, which again I've demonstrated before, but the charger clip holding 5 Lee Enfield rounds, Lee Enfield 303 rounds. You could push one clip in, you could then push a second clip in, so very, very quickly you could load 10 rounds. In these early rifles, the one half of the charger bridge was actually mounted on the head of the bolt, so it actually slid backwards with the bolt, which was very quickly modified because it wasn't a particularly successful idea. But straight away, it meant that you could load the rifle very, very rapidly, and straight away you're in action with 10 rounds, whereas virtually all the opposition were still armed, the Germans in particular, armed with a Mauser rifle with only 5 rounds. So it was a state-of-the-art piece of equipment, it really was. But of course, in 1904, the British Army had still got an enormous amount of the long Lee Enfield rifles, which they'd been making since 1895. And in order to save money, the majority of those long Lee Enfield rifles were converted to the new charger loading system. So they became known as the charger loading Lee Enfield. So again, pretty much exactly as they were during the South African War, except this time they've got a decent sight protector on them because that had become an issue, that the sights were getting damaged. And this time it's got that all-important charger bridge, so you could load these very, very rapidly. So this particular one having belonged to the 2nd, 5th Sussex and the 5th Suffolk at some point in time, so almost certainly seen service, maybe Gallipoli or somewhere like that. So despite the fact that these in theory were obsolete by the time the war broke out, they do still see service, and there's still quite a lot of them around. There is a problem in that some of the ammunition wasn't a very good match. So the early Mark V ammunition was round-nosed. That didn't work particularly well in the short magazine Lee Enfield rifles, and vice versa. So it was quite crucial that you had the right ammunition for the job. The long rifles, right through from the Metford to, in fact, even to the SMLE to begin with, had these short bayonets because obviously it was a longer rifle, so there wasn't the need for a longer bayonet. But when they introduced the short magazine Lee Enfield, they simply adapted it, which meant that by the time it was fitted on a shorter rifle, it gave the opposition an advantage. So then, obviously, there was a need to introduce a longer bayonet. So the 1907 pattern sword bayonet was introduced then and would see service right up into the middle of the Second World War. The most common rifle during the First World War was the Mark III and later the Mark III Star, but this one's a Mark III because it's still got that long range, the volley fire sights on it, and it's still got the magazine cut off. Again, all of those will be deleted in 1916, in January 1916, because they serve no real useful purpose and they're just a waste of time and energy and materials. But again, this was an incredibly dependable piece of kit. The only time I've ever heard First War veterans moaning about it were the fellows who served in Palestine, because in order to make this work, the bolt was oiled, and they just said that all of the grit and the sand and the dust would always just stick to the bolt, so you were forever cleaning it. Whereas the German Mauser had a polished bolt, which didn't need oil. So, but generally speaking, I mean, there's always a debate about this, but I do think that this was probably the better battlefield rifle. As I've always said in the past, the German Mauser action, it had that bolt that stuck straight out the side, which meant that having fired it, you had to move your head out of the way in order to reload it. Whereas this Lee Enfield action, once you'd loaded it with the 10 rounds and you'd found your target, you literally never need to take your eye off the target until you'd knocked him over. It was a real game changer as far as the British Army were concerned, and they went out of their way just to train every soldier, every infantry soldier, to be a marksman, and they shot for their pay. So it was in your best interests to become a marksman. The better shot you were, the more money you'd earn, the more you could spend in the bar or with your mates down the pub. So the short magazine, the Enfield rifle, would continue on into the 20s and 30s. The later rifle, what will become known as the number 4, we'll come on to in a moment, that had been developed very early in the interwar period, but again, there'd been no, there were thousands of these SMLEs in store. Over 1 million of them had been made during the First World War, 1,117,850 or something like that between August 1914 and the armistice. So there were no shortage of Lee Enfield rifles in armouries all across the country. So there was no real impetus to introduce a new rifle in the interwar period. So in 1939, the British Army goes to war with exactly the same rifle in the same form, still with these piling swivels and the brass butt marker discs, which had the unit details on, in exactly this form. In 1941, after Dunkirk, the orders came about to remove the piling swivels and remove the brass butt marker discs, just to save materials. The piling swivel, you'll be familiar with photographs of groups of soldiers with the soldiers sort of resting with their rifles stacked in little tripods, and that's what these were for. There was a drill manoeuvre to pile arms. So on a route march, you'd stop for your 10 minutes in the hour. The troops would, the front rank would about face, and in groups of 4, they would pile arms together. 3 would hook their rifles together, and the 4th would lay it up against it. And at the end of the 10-minute break, they would fall in again in the same thing, unpile arms, the front rank would about turn, and then they'd march off. So it was a useful piece of kit in an age when marching was a form of transport, but by the time the Second War had come about, in theory, it was a mechanised war, so the piling swivels were considered to be less of a necessity and were rapidly done away with. Even though eventually the number 4 rifle replaces them, it's not until 1947 that the British Army officially make these obsolete for land service, for army service. The Navy used them for a bit longer, I think even into the 50s. They still have them on board ship for dealing with all sorts of things like shooting at mines and goodness knows what else. And some other armies continued. I mean, the Australians were still making them. They still carried them into the Korean War, and certainly in India they carried on with their rechambered into later calibers, and on the northwest frontier there are still tribesmen that still make them in some form or other. So a very, very long time for one particular make and model to be in service. As I'd mentioned, what was originally the number 1 Mark IV became the number 4 Mark I, and was formally adopted in, I think, 1931. But at the time, it wasn't considered necessary to make them because they had plenty. And the other thing was that all the previous rifles were made by craftsmen. You needed those craftsman skills to make them, whereas the number 4s were pretty much designed to be mass produced, which it was going to take time for the factories to actually get up to that level of production. The decision was made in October 1939 to go ahead and put these into production, but it would still take until the middle of 1941 before the first ones were actually rolling off the production lines. And you really don't see these appearing in vast numbers until the Normandy campaign, when certainly all of the sort of the main assault troops have got them. But out in the Far East, they do start to trickle out there, and you see both the SMLEs and the number 4s in use at the same time. In the Italian campaign, men being sent out to Italy very often take these with them, but obviously the problem then is if you've got 2 different types of weapons, then the armourers have got to carry spares for 2 different types as well. So that's the reason that there wasn't such a rapid transformation to the new rifles, certainly in far-flung places like Italy. The number 4s would carry on in service obviously after the war. That they would see service really right up until the end of the 1950s and beyond in some cases, and certainly the sniper rifles that the police were using, the number 4Ts with the telescopic sights, well into the 70s or 80s, because they just had such great stopping power. Partway through the Second World War, there was considered a need for a lightened version, originally for airborne troops, and later for use in the jungle, because obviously trying to move your way around in dense jungle, it was much better to have a shorter rifle. So what was the lightened number 4 eventually transforms into what becomes the number 5, and even though I don't think it was ever actually called the jungle carbine, it's certainly what it's always known as. And these had a rubber pad on the end to absorb some of the shock, because obviously you're firing the same .303 caliber bullet, which has a hell of a kick on a normal rifle, but by the time you're firing out of a little short carbine like this, it really does kick when you fire it. They were very popular in the Malaya campaign. I mean, I think they hardly saw any service during the Second World War. I think the airborne had them right at the end of the war. But certainly during the Malaya campaign, they were very popular. And the old Suffolk Regiment soldiers, the men of 1 Suffolk, said that they used to tie they never carried them with slings on in the jungle, because you always wanted to be ready to use it, not have it over your shoulder. And to stop the sling swivels rattling, they were tied up with a piece of jungle bootlace. But they weren't just used in the jungle. I mean, there's some great photographs, certainly at Suffolk Regiment Depot at Gibraltar Barracks at Bury St Edmunds, of fellas doing their training, doing their basic training with these little short rifles, which look very odd to us now, but they certainly saw service all the way through to the end of the 50s and beyond. In 1958, the Army start trialling the the self-loading rifle made by FN in Belgium, which literally looks like it's come from another planet, a completely different animal. I mean, self-loading as in that once you've cocked it, every time you pull the trigger it recocks. It's automatic. You don't need to do any of that bolt action stuff. It does it all for you. And so really, by this stage, it's fair to say that the age of the bolt action rifle in the British Army was finally over. So there you have it. As I said, a short, sharp lesson in the development of the British Lee Enfield rifle, and it's a fascinating study. You can look at, there's so much detail you can look into, but hopefully this will just have given you a taster where it came from, where it went to, and obviously for those of you with specific interest in the First War or the Second World War, just an idea, just a hint of how it came about at that particular moment in time that the British had such a cracking good rifle. So, I hope you've enjoyed that. All that's left for me to say, as usual, is thank you all very much for watching. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I look forward to seeing you all again next month.